University of California is the premier public university in the world, and it is our affirmative obligation to take on pressing societal issues. So we are very pleased to work with you on this particular dimension. I do want to again recognize Doug and Tim and Julie for their excellent work in putting this conference together. And I also want to acknowledge the presence in the room today of a number of our Ziman Center board members. So thank you to all of you who are here today. We now have our second session. And in this second session, we are going to try to be positive, and we're going to try to be constructive. And what this means is we're going to directly hit upon a set of issues that were addressed in one way or another coming into this, but perhaps we can do this in a substantive manner, and we simply will ask each of our panelists to address the question of how precisely, how in your opinion, how on the basis of your experience can we undertake definitive affirmative steps to make LA more affordable? Hi. Now, before we get to that, I just want to say one word about the why. The why has two pieces, and you heard those pieces articulated in part by our keynote. The first part of why is that affordable housing, in terms of scientific literature, is associated with a lot of adverse and negative outcomes. And those outcomes relate to health, they relate to job access, they relate to learning, they relate to the fact that affordable housing typically is built in less desirable parts of the metropolitan area, and capitalized into the values of those properties are amenities that are less desirable. So that housing is typically near bad air. It's typically in proximate to schools that are well performing. And I know I'm saying typically, there are many, many exceptions, but we have a very significant documentation in the literature of all of the human adverse consequences of lack of affordable housing. But what about politicians? Why do they care? And let me suggest the following. They do care in terms of votes, but if Mayor Garcetti was here, and Mayor Garcetti's a good guy and a friend of many of us, and I don't want to besmirch in any way, shape, or form, but we care at the metro level because, as has been articulated, when we don't have affordable housing, we don't have job growth. We have job flight. We don't have the economic activity that's consistent with the potential of the metro area. And if you think about cities in the nation somewhat organically, you might appreciate that cities are always rising and falling. And when New York gets too expensive, Goldman Sachs takes the entirety of their back office employment and puts it in Salt Lake City. And when LA gets too expensive, people migrate to Las Vegas or to Denver or to Phoenix or whatever. So this is ongoing organically all the time. And will, of course, continue to be what it is. But with that, Garcetti or whoever, we all have a vested interest in making LA vital. So even if you think that your interest is to draw a big fence around your neighborhood and assure that there's no affordable housing that enters, the idea is this lack of affordable housing ultimately will take out some of the jobs, and we'll take out some of the vitality, and we'll take the economic base away from us. And anyway, let's get forward. Let's move forward. Let me introduce the foursome, and I'm going to start with the individual on my left, Rick Jacobus, who's the principal at Street Level Urban Impact Advisors. Is that okay? So we are moving next to Ben Metcalf, who you just heard, Director of the State of California Housing and Community Development. From there to Ben Besley, Chair of the Board of Commissioners of the Housing Authority of the City of LA. Ben, welcome. And Kevin Ratner, President of Forest City Residential West. Now, in terms of order here, how about if we do the following? Start with Rick. Is that good? We're going to go from Rick to, let's see if I have this right, Ben Besley. Is that all? Am I doing well there?
Sounds great.
Kevin, we'll take you third, okay? And Ben number 2, Ben Metcalf, you'll back clean up, okay? And you had a lot to say previously, and then you'll sort of be the respondee if that works for you. So let me get out of the way, and we're going to get Rick up here first. Rick, please help us to answer this question of how.
I've just always assumed, like a lot of people in the affordable housing world, that there was this other problem, market rate housing, and somebody else was taking care of that, and we could just ignore that. And I think what we've seen in the last little few years is that was a really bad assumption. And in my neck of the woods, I live in the Bay Area. People are now fighting a lot about the role that the market is playing or can play in the housing crisis. And we have some people who say, if we just get the government out of the way and let the market build, that'll take care of the problem. And we have other people who say, no, the market is the problem. And particularly we have gentrifying neighborhoods, and market rate development is maybe the cause of displacement. And this is a huge fight that's holding us back. And so what I've been trying to do, mostly focused on the affordable housing industry, is to model a different way of talking about the problem. Because I think it's a political problem, first and foremost, and we're not going to solve it unless we build a different kind of political coalition. So there's actually been a lot of research about where the public will comes from for affordable housing. And we spend almost all of our time in the affordable housing field talking about the need. I mean, you've already seen that today. We talk about the need all the time. But it turns out the American public is completely on board that there's a need for affordable housing. We don't need to convince them of that at all. They already believe it. The barrier, the problem that we have building public will, is that they don't believe we have an answer. Right? Or that they don't believe we have an answer that's going to work at scale. Right? So we have two competing answers in the sort of marketplace of ideas that are undermining each other, is my analysis of this. One is people say we could just we just need more subsidy, right? If we just had more subsidy, then the problem would be solved. But people just at this intuitive level realize that we aren't going to have enough subsidy to solve the problem at the scale that we have. That's not a reason not to provide subsidy, but it's just not a satisfying answer. And so what you've seen over the last few years is that as the need has risen, public support for more investment has declined. And the reason for that is that people are daunted by the problem. They don't think it's going to be enough. So they're actually less likely to help. At the same time, we have this other argument that says, well, if we just built more, we could build our way out of the problem. And that's the same problem, right? People know intuitively how much we would have to build to provide housing that was affordable for the average service worker. This is what they do in China, right? They build these empty cities. That's what we would have to do if we wanted the market to bring housing down to the level where we didn't have a homelessness problem, we didn't have a problem for very low income workers, right? We would have to build at that scale. And, we're not going to do that in America. Who's going to finance the empty skyscrapers, right? You got to, build enough that the market rent starts to come down, and at a certain point it comes down below the cost that you can support the construction, right? And so you stop building. The market stops as soon as you hit that point. So we can't get, with just production, we can't get down to the level where the people perceive the greatest need. So we've been selling people on these two competing ideas, and the average person who knows nothing about this field just intuitively doesn't buy that either of those two strategies is going to work. And yet, people get up in front of city council every week, or in front of the planning commission every week and say, all we need to do is build more housing. All we need to do is provide more subsidy. People know that's not going to work. We have to do both of those things if we want people to feel like there's a real strategy that could actually win. Part of the problem is that we have convinced ourselves that the problem should be easier than it really is. You never see an op-ed on this topic that doesn't have the phrase Econ 101 in it, right? Everybody wants this to be Econ 101. But someone teach econ here at UCLA? This isn't covered. Housing markets are not what you study in Econ 101. They're an advanced topic. So I went looking for where's the data on how production affects affordability. And there's very little research recently. Most of it is from the 70s and 80s. And so I had to go and dig up this book, which was phenomenally helpful. From the beginning of the 90s, using data from the 70s, I was literally the first person to check this book out in 15 years. But they got data from hundreds of metro regions across the country, and they ran these massive and fascinating regressions, and they built a complex model of how the market actually works. And I will spare you the regression results and just share one thing that I think is sort of an observation that is missing from our conversation today, which is that the market is segmented. We don't have one housing market. We have several different housing markets that are related, but they're not completely the same. So supply and demand move independently in different segments of the market. Let me show you what I mean by that. So when we add supply at the very top of the market, immediately rents drop or prices drop. Supply and Econ 101, right? Supply and demand works. When we add supply, prices come down. But they don't come down evenly across the whole economy, right? They come down incrementally in different segments. So what happens is, over time, when the luxury price drops, some people move up from the sort of high-end market to the luxury market, right? They step up. And what the result of that is that sort of as the price drop happens, it happens most in those segments of the market closest to where the supply is added. And it happens less the further away you get. So adding luxury housing doesn't make a noticeable difference to the rent that a working family pays, right? Because it doesn't quite filter. This is filtering. This is how filtering actually works. But it doesn't filter immediately down all the way. It's less effective each step down. The same is true when we add affordable supply, right? When we add a new tax credit project, we have an impact on the rents immediately around, at the lower end of the market. Not just in that building, but in the whole rest of the market, because people move out. But that doesn't translate into savings for people who are buying luxury units, right? It's just the market is segmented. So what we have now is this place where we're building at these two different points in the market and not much in between. And if you look at the housing crisis from the point of view of an elected official, this is the crisis. The voters are clustered in that middle segment, and we're not really doing things that are impacting their housing costs, right? We have this gap in the middle that's very sizable. So what if we were to do something to sort of provide supply at that point, right? If we could provide more middle income supply, it would have a trickle out effect, right? I'm calling it middle out housing, right? We could put the housing in at the middle, it would trickle out and it would help people. And ideally, we could do this without subsidy, right? If we could get the market to work, because I think we have two different problems. We have an affordable housing problem that's a perennial problem that's gonna be here no matter how much we build. People can't afford to support the cost of housing. They need help to do that. But then we have a middle income housing problem that's a market failure. And the market is the way you fix that. And so we need to have both of these answers together if we want to have a holistic strategy that's really going to work. And I think that, the market problem, I'm going to wrap up here, the market problem is about volume, right? I'm sorry, I'm going to show this one more thing. People say, well, why don't we build middle income housing? And they say, oh, it's because the developers make more money on luxury housing. And that's not really how it works, is it? If you look at the auto industry, right, if the auto industry worked like the housing market, poor people would be driving 50-year-old BMWs. But they're not. They're driving 15-year-old Honda Civics for the most part, right? The auto industry provides housing at a much wider spectrum of the market. They provide middle class cars. We don't do that in housing. The money is there. The money is the most profitable products in Toyota's lineup is the Camry, not the Lexus. That's where they make their money. But what happens in the housing market is exactly what would happen in the auto industry if we said to Toyota, you can only build 50,000 cars a year. They'd stop building the Camry and they'd stop building the Corolla and they would only build the Lexus because the margin per car is higher. So to me, the answer to solving the market problem is volume. We have to build more, and we have to build more in more places and more middle income places. And when we do that, we're going to have the message to people isn't we're going to build more luxury housing and it's going to trickle down on everybody. It's if you want to build for the middle class, you have to build at a higher volume. And that's not an alternative to providing affordable housing, it's a complement. So I'm going to stop there.
All right. My name is Ben Besley, and I am here. I actually have two different roles in this housing market. I am a private infill residential developer, most recently with City Ventures, and prior to that, the Olson Company, very active infill builders throughout the state of California. And also, I have the privilege of serving as the board chair of the Housing Authority here in the city of Los Angeles. I want to speak with you first this morning from the private developer's perspective, but later in the conversation, I think there's some interesting observations around some of the challenges we have with the Housing Authority when we are building affordable income-restricted housing. So a couple things I'd like to get across this morning. First, I just have a couple of pieces of information to share about the magnitude of the problem. I think we've heard some pretty big numbers here already this morning. I have the answer, so get ready to write this down. And then also, I have some specific solutions for how we can get to where we need to go. And it all comes down to changing some of our zoning rules, but how we can make that process work a little bit better than it has been working. So first of all, the numbers. I've heard this a number of times. In fact, I think I heard it earlier this morning, that the number of homes we need to build in the city of Los Angeles to get the supply up to the point where this pricing dynamic is not, it doesn't continually create upward pressure, is about 800,000. 800,000 new homes in the city of LA. And maybe it's 400,000. Who knows what that exact number is, but order of magnitude, it's hundreds of thousands of homes, right? I happened to be talking to somebody at City Hall last week who mentioned that there are a little over 800,000 parcels of land in the city of Los Angeles. So it just struck me, if we're thinking about how many homes we need to add, and I think we need to be intentional about this, we're talking about adding one unit, one home, to every single parcel throughout the city, or roughly that. So whether it's within the building, on top of the building, next to the building, when we're thinking about the impact that we need to have, let's just be realistic that it will change the physical landscape of a lot of parts of the city. And we need to enlist different parts of the market to make that acceptable. So where are we going to build these hundreds of thousands of homes? Who are we building them for? I think, you made the point earlier that it has to be a middle out strategy, building to the top of the market and hoping things trickle down. It doesn't sound like the solution that's going to work. And there, of course, there are a number of modes of doing this. Project-based affordable housing is a big part of it. Private home building is a big part of it. Smaller units is part of the solution. But to me, we need to find a way to build a home that a family can live in, and on a median income, $60,000, maybe $70,000 for a household, they can afford that house and not spend more than 35% of their income living there. So what is that? What is that the private market can provide? It's going to cost around $350,000 to $375,000. And we'll get to some numbers here in a minute, but that's what we should be hoping to do. We should be hoping to build hundreds of thousands of homes that would cost $350,000 to $375,000 to purchase. Okay, you ready? Here it is. And when I give you this, you guys can't all run out of the room and go try to find land. Okay, just promise me you'll stick around to the end of the presentation. No, it's pretty. I think it's pretty simple. It's what at my job at City Ventures and previously at the Olson Company, this is what we built. These are townhomes. These are family attached for sale housing. They're 3-bed, 4-bed, 2-bed, 2-bath, 3-bath, 4-bath. I mean, these are nice houses, and they're built in communities anywhere from 20 at a time to 120 at a time. But this building typology, and I'm going to show you how the math that gets us there. This building typology is the way to get density at the highest residual land value, and that's what creates transactions in land and development. So when we're thinking about how do we solve this problem, it's a huge problem, and we need, with the magnitude of the problem, we need the private sector to be a big part of it. We need the development community to be a big part of it. We need to be intentional about what we are zoning to, and I'm going to argue that we should be zoning to something like this. So what does it cost to build one of these homes? Really quickly. The building itself, the physical structure, at City Ventures we did this, at Olson Company we did this. We're building these for about $150,000 for the actual physical structure. When you're building in production and you're designing thoughtfully, structurally, and with all of the specifications and everything, we're building to $70 or $75 a square foot. 1,500 square feet, 1,550 square feet. This is a very comfortable home. Add on your permitting and your school fees, your design costs.
Union wage?
No, not union wage. Not union wage. Is this microphone not working? So then you have the cost to actually develop the land, $40,000. That's covering your permit fees and your grading and your utility connections. You've got the financing costs, and then of course, unfortunately, we do have to pay these developers a profit. So we're going to give them an 8% margin on this. And when you add all this up, it's about $250,000. And this is not every project, but this is achievable. And this is what we did. Again, we did this hundreds of times at City Ventures and hundreds of times at the Olson Company. This can be built. So what does this mean in terms of building homes for people that can afford something like this? Well, if you take an income from $50,000 to $60,000 to $70,000, and you look at a reasonable amount of somebody's income that they're spending on housing, 30 to 35%, translate that into a mortgage, or if an apartment scenario, it's the capitalized value of the net operating income off of this one unit. It's on the order of $275,000 to $375,000. So if we can sell the house at that price, we can satisfy this middle segment of the market. And when you build in this townhome configuration at around 15 units per acre, you're getting up to some residual land values, $2 million, and if you tweak some of the assumptions with density and maybe you reduce some costs, you're competitive for land. And I know today, $2 million an acre for land is hard to find, but it's out there. A couple of years ago, there were lots of opportunities to do this. So I don't mean to say that today we're going to go find the thousands of opportunities to build this. The point of making this example is that if we want the private sector to be involved in this, which I believe they need to be to work at a scale of this size, we just need to start by, with a very specific target. We need to build to this income level, so we need to be able to price it at $375,000 or thereabout. So what can we build that can satisfy that market? And my solution is, or a solution, is going to be the townhome. So I think that the purpose of this is not to say that, again, this doesn't work in every case, but it's to suggest that, yes, there is an answer. There really is an answer. So let's see here. What do I got? So just really quickly, getting back to how we're actually going to get all this done. We do need to do a lot of upzoning. This is just really quick, from the private developer's perspective, where this gets askew is once you're re-entitling a project, your financing costs and the profit, which is really the risk premium, drives it up, which increases your cost, reduces residual land value, and you're either left with increasing the cost of the home, which we have to do in certain cases, or you just don't build a house. And so this is kind of getting back to what's preventing us from building a lot more in a very abstract way. It's the fact that this process adds cost to the financing and sort of the risk premium of building all these homes. So let me get to some solutions here really quickly. So the first solution, getting back to this very specific building type, is to zone with an intent, that we have in mind what we can build at a low cost and still high quality and very livable home that generates the residual land value that actually lets these transactions happen in the private market. That's step one, be intentional about it. Number two, I think that there is, talking about the political will, I think most of us have been in a city council hearing and watched a council member or a planning commissioner deliberate over what to do with a project. And when you have a lot of people who already live in the neighborhood opposing a project, it's difficult to do. It's hard to blame the politicians, the elected officials, when they're in front of a room of very angry people. The people who are not represented in this political discourse are the future homebuyers. It's the people that aren't there yet, right? So I think there's two opportunities here for the private development community to get involved. The first is that there are advocacy groups out there who actually have picked up on this idea. The one that I've heard most recently the most about is Abundant Housing Los Angeles. Is anybody here from Abundant Housing this morning? They might be here. There's a group that's gotten a lot of publicity up in the Bay Area called San Francisco Bay Area Renters Federation. If you guys know Sonia Traus. If you don't, you should look her up. She's phenomenal. So these are folks that are basically going out to people like me who would love to buy a house and saying, hey, if you want to buy a house and you want it to be in Carson or in Eagle Rock or in Long Beach or in Fremont up in the Bay Area, you need to come to the hearing. Like, you need to be there so that people understand this is the person who is, will be your neighbor and advocate for the other side of the demand curve, if you will. The second, and this is a little bit more controversial, is that if there is actually, if you look at how much money an individual home buyer is spending, the premium to buy a house these days, it's a lot of economic value. I would suggest that some of the rules that the Bureau of Real Estate has put in place in terms of requiring a certain point in development before you can sign contracts or even take deposits or make those non-refundable, if those rules go away, as they are in states like, I don't know about New York, but certainly in Florida, where you're seeing a lot of development, again, it gives the prospective homebuyer or renter a stake, a real financial stake in seeing it get done. And all of this is suggest that in the political discourse, whether it's the council chambers where this conversation is happening, or whether it's the public meeting for the community plan, you've got people showing up there and saying, we really need to do this. Like, I need a house. You're representing the people who are already there, but we need to bring into this conversation the people who won't ever get there if we can't build them a new house. And then, what was my last suggestion? Oh, ADU. Thank you. So finally, the ADU clarifications in the rules on ADUs, I think, has actually been very interesting because it could effectively really increase the density and get us a long ways towards where we need to go. I think it's only a matter of time before one or a number of groups, get financing and really operationalize this the way that, a regional home builder could. I mean, it's a huge opportunity. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see some groups coming along and approaching that as a public home builder might. So those are my solutions.
So I am a developer, currently a developer, not a recovering developer, which I was for a while there in the early 2000s. But I am currently working. So I have a couple reactions to what you guys have all been talking about and what I've heard around today. I think one of the things that's really interesting that I think I heard Ben you touch on just briefly is the fact that the half of the problem, let's say, is supply. The other half of the problem is demand. So the demand side is there, but people can't afford to either buy or rent homes, so they just need to earn more money. So we have an economic problem. We have an income problem, which no one in this room, I don't believe, can fix, but yet we all have a part in. So affordability is not just bringing the cost down, it's bringing their ability to rent or buy up. And so that is a large issue, and I would say the sort of elephant in the room around here that we're talking about. Los Angeles is a heavily rental area. I think it's something like 54% of the population rents. So, Rick, I hear what you're saying, and I agree. Homes to buy are very important, but homes to rent are even more important. Smaller units, we build small units. We're doing a lot of work in San Francisco. Small, really, really small units. Obviously, you're not putting a family of 4 or more into one of those small units. You can barely fit one person into some of those units. But they're renting, and they're renting for astronomically high numbers. So I think that family for rent housing that's affordable, getting the families to earn the income, and being able to build more are all part of the solutions. I think that's a super difficult problem. Even if I had a magic wand, I don't know that I could give you the answer to how to do that. The other thing that we've looked at, we've tried to find solution. We've tried prefab multifamily product. We most recently tried it in Brooklyn. It was a spectacular failure. We did it out here in California. We did it all over the country in the 70s with something called the Dillon system, which was a preformed concrete product, which we could put up incredibly fast, but it was heavily subsidized by something called UDAG grants out of DC, and we did it all over the country, and you had to keep going and going and going and going, because if the factory shut down, then you would lose the factory space, and then you couldn't get it started again because it was incredibly cost prohibitive. But as it was being done, we produced a lot of units. But other than those two solutions, what I have never been able to figure out is how to build a B building, right? Every building that I build, almost by definition, is an A building. New buildings are A buildings. So even if I build a type 3 walk-up apartment building, way out in the valley, it's still going to be a brand new building, therefore going to get the top of the market rent. So in that chart I think Rick was showing about how to build out from the middle and building at the top, almost by definition, everything new is at the top. So affordability by design is something that we've tried to crack numerous times and have really never been able to do it. I think part of what you're talking about on the for sale side, I think it is more possible. I think there's more opportunity to do that. So I think that's really part of the problem. And then, let's face it, there was redevelopment, and we did a lot of work with redevelopment in and around downtown Los Angeles, and we built a lot of affordable housing. Redevelopment went away. There was a massive housing boom. There is no affordable housing being built in downtown, and there's literally hundreds of thousands of units available and then being built around downtown. They're all being built in high-rise configurations. They're incredibly expensive buildings, and the rents are going to be $4, $5 a foot. I mean, I don't know how many people there are in the city who want to live in downtown who can afford those units. I'm starting to get nervous about the product that I'm building, which is actually not a high-rise, so I'm going to be a little bit lower in price, but still, that's what's being built, and there's no affordable housing being built in there. And the reason is because they don't have to, right? As much as I hate to say that as a developer, because I am a for-profit person, that is what I have to do. I have shareholders, I have people I have to answer to, so I can't just take less profit. I have to try to maximize my profit and maximize the dollars that I'm investing in order to get the highest return that I can get. And in downtown, that means building high-rise and all of that kind of stuff. I think another part of the problem, which I have an anecdotal example of, is up in San Francisco. We had a property which we built in the early 80s, mid 80s, first round of tax credits, 86 tax reform, about 800 units down in the Embarcadero, 20% affordable, 80% of median income. We actually extended for a little while, and end of last year, the regulatory agreement expired, and I could have taken 172 units to market. And the value of those units, of me taking those units to market, was huge, $600,000 a unit for a product that was built in the 80s. And it just happened to be now in a fantastic location in San Francisco. Everyone wants to do it. The city came to me and said, you can't take them all to market. And I said, I beg to differ. I can take them to market. That's the benefit of the deal I did with you, not you exactly, but you, city, 30 plus years ago, and I'm going to take them to market. And they said, well, you happen to have some other product that maybe you want to get entitled, and, maybe that might not go so well. And I was like, okay, that's fair enough. Let's sit and have a chat. So what they wound up doing is taking their housing dollars, which turned now into housing preservation dollars, and preserved half of the units at an agreed upon income level, which was actually at 120% of median income. They raised that, right, trying to get the middle, which is super important and really hard to produce. If you look at where they have units, they have very few units in that income strata. And so they preserved half of them, and then half of them, as they turn over, as people leave, I can then take those units to market. So between those two things, I gave a little, they gave a little, we found a deal that worked. I think that's something that also needs to be talked about, is housing preservation, right? Because there's just no way to build our way out of the problem. There's just no way. So I'm trying to be positive, Stuart. I'm trying my best to be positive, but it's really something to think about. And then added into this, Ben also touched on it in his keynote, is sustainability, right? So I go up to Portland and I see Portland put a development boundary around its urban core and say you can't build outside of this in the configuration you want. So if you want, you have to build it in here. What does that do? That changes pricing dynamics, it changes all kinds of things. But I think more compact development is something that we have to realize is more sustainable, and we have to figure out how to solve that problem too. So it just keeps getting harder.
Let me just offer a couple of quick observations, just in my cleanup role here. Correct the record on a few factual inaccuracies.
Please do,
Okay?
yes, please do.
So, first of all, I mean, I think this framework that the speakers have mentioned of the sort of the bell curve of where the energy is on housing is really illuminating. But I definitely don't think it's maybe quite as tight a distinction as Rick, you talked about, and the issue of, well, all I'm doing are A properties, they're not really helping. I don't think that's what you meant, but I certainly see, one of the great trends that's happening right now in California is a very steady in-migration of higher income individuals and a steady out-migration of lower income individuals. All the data supports that. And I think our basic challenge is that those folks who do have the money and the wealth and the income are very good at outbidding the folks who don't for the product that really they shouldn't be living in, because it's really a lower income existing product. And so part of why we need the luxury in some sense is to give the folks who have the money a way to steer clear so they're not bidding up the prices of the folks who really need that more B or C level product. Yeah, the other observation, I think we talked about cost issues and just all the ways in which we have to really figure out how to get the cost drivers down, because otherwise land just sits idle. And one of the things that strikes me is just a report that McKinsey Global put out a month or two ago that observed that the construction industry is probably the only industry in America that has seen no productivity gains in the last half century. And you would think that modular or something else would have come along to save the day here. But it hasn't yet. And I think we need to really be looking critically at that and thinking about, well, what is it that offers real hope, and how do we not just do what we did in the 70s or 80s over again and watch it fail yet again? And then lastly, Prop 13, the 800-pound gorilla in the room, I think we have to put that back out there in a couple of ways. One is the tendency on the cost side of cities to really use the sort of last person in as the way to raise the revenues that support the rest of the community through things like development fees and impact fees, and what that's doing to drive down construction. And also the ways in which revenue and chasing revenue for cities determines decisions that are made at the local level and encourage local approvals for retail or other sales tax producing uses versus property taxes. That's something that my boss, the governor, called out specifically in his budget statement earlier this year, saying we have to figure out a corrective on that. How do we get cities to want to do the right thing? How do we sort of provide an incentive against where maybe Prop 13 would otherwise take us? And then lastly, I do think, as was mentioned, there are really good examples outside California of cities that are doing this well. Not just the sort of Houstons and Austins that can sprawl endlessly, but also our neighbors like Portland and Seattle that have really done amazing things in the ADU space. And just in the permitting space. I mean, Seattle, relative to population, is, producing twice as many units as San Francisco. We need to really figure out the secret sauce there.
Great. Well, gentlemen, thank you for your truly excellent remarks. Ladies, please. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to come momentarily to your opportunity to interface directly in a Q&A with the panel. Before we do so, just a couple of comments or a little bit of my own sort of question here. Firstly, with respect to a point that Kevin made, a point that Kevin opened up with, if you look at affordability problems around the country, it's interesting to note, and this isn't perhaps widely known, that affordability constraints extend beyond coastal California and coastal eastern seaboard. And in fact, when you plot affordability constraints, you'll see that they're alive and well in the broad cross-section of the interior of the country. And this goes directly to the point that Kevin made. There, the issue isn't pricing. The issue is job loss and income. So remember, affordability is price over income. And where you have incomes declining and jobs leaving, you have affordability problems. So in terms of a consensus, a national conversation about affordability that gets beyond Los Angeles or San Francisco, that conversation can be had, and the dimensions or causal factors differ. Now, one question to the panel, just to sort of kick this off. So far today, even since we began today, there's a word that hasn't been mentioned. And I believe that that word is particularly germane to Los Angeles, and that word is 2 words, transportation infrastructure. So to the panel, would it be an extreme, an egregious statement to suggest to the mayor that a primary element of affordability policy here in Los Angeles could be associated with transportation infrastructure development? In other words, we've got terrible congestion problems in LA. We have a egregious over-reliance on private automobiles. People can't get from here to there. And if you could open up other parts of the metro area, in fact, parts of the metro area with low land rents, because of the fact that you can't get to anywhere from those areas, you can indeed profitably build lots of affordable housing in low land rent areas and get people from those areas to jobs through efficient transportation infrastructure. So the question to the panel is, what is the role of transportation infrastructure development in affordable housing policy?
So I did have a slide that I sort of skipped over or moved through pretty quickly that just looked at the share of income spent on transportation plus housing in the context of wages. And I think, it might be that we really need to spend more time looking at the world through that lens, because I think in every day people are making housing choices. They are making exactly those trade-offs. Do I live closer to my job but pay more in rent and save on, or do I make the commute? And I think there is the data also shows in land values very consistent correlation between walkability to transit, and it varies by metro to metro area. Some metro areas with better transit systems see more of that curve in proximity to transit. But I think part of it, what you're getting at, it seems to me, is to use a word others have been using, intentionality, right? So as we make our transportation investments, we really should be thinking at the same time about where we want our housing to go. First of all, so that we can sort of, as a public agency, as a public body, try and capture and steer some of that value and not leave it to the market to profit from necessarily. And I think we did with SB 375 at the state level really put a frame at the regional level. Okay, so when we do our regional transportation plans, we should also be doing our housing plans. And so for the last 5 or 6 years, our regional governments have been endeavoring to do that. And I think the disconnect often is probably going from the regional level down to the local level to say, okay, does this continue to line up with our regional plan? Does it continue to line up with our regional housing and transportation plans?
Kevin.
Just a couple thoughts on that also. One is in transportation is also schools, right? So when people make choices about where they're going to live, a large part of that is the school system, right? So one of the great things, and both the blessing and the curse of real estate, it is a very fundamental industry, right? So we touch everything, and everything touches us. So it's hard. It's like playing a game of whack-a-mole. It's hard to get one thing to work without the other, something else popping up. So I completely agree on the transportation. I think that the sustainability side of that is super important. In New York City, we built a 900-unit high-rise with, I think, like 10 parking spaces, maybe. So, on an acre of land, there's just so many different ways of thinking about land use and how it's done and what you do with it. But it is very. It's like a spider's web, right? It touches everything that we participate in and drive those decisions. So thinking holistically is a really super important thing to do, and it starts from the federal government and goes all the way down to my block, and it happens really quickly. So transportation, I think, is obviously a huge part of that, and Los Angeles has made big strides in that, big investments in that. Have to applaud that, and the ridership is happening. Ridership is going up, and it's great. We built a big apartment project in Chinatown, right on the Gold Line stop, and people are actually not having cars at the project, which blew me away. I couldn't believe it. So I think it's an interesting, evolving conversation, particularly here in Los Angeles.
So
Could I address that?
Oh, please.
Sorry.
didn't interrupt you, but one, I would like to, while not diminishing the value of having a very robust public transportation system and multimodal transit, I think when we're having this conversation about creating more housing, I think we need to not look at transportation as the solution. I think it's going to be a battle, like to get a lot of cities to agree and to get their residents and voters to agree that we need to upzone your neighborhood is going to be a very difficult conversation. And so to say, hey, I've got a solution, let's go, let me just tax you and we'll build some rail and you don't have to worry about it. I think it's avoiding the bigger issue. Just to reference myself one more time, no, I really do feel like I've started to hear more and more about this. I do believe that there are individuals and constituent groups that I hope will start to emerge that will bring the other side of that argument, which is that yes, we absolutely need to build more in my neighborhood, in my backyard.
Okay.
Okay, now I'm going to add to that. Sorry. Kevin raised a really good point about when you build, even if you want to build middle-income housing, if you build it and you somehow manage to build it less expensively, if the demand is so high, you're going to sell it at a high price. And the trend toward building around transit has been great for all kinds of reasons, but it hasn't translated into low-cost housing. Partly because it's very easy to convince yourself that a neighborhood is totally changing when there's new transit coming in. So it drives a whole new market. To me, the way we get middle-income housing isn't necessarily by design. It might require design changes. It's by location. We have in every city huge swaths of land that are where the market rent is not going to support luxury rents, or the market price is not going to support luxury prices. The trick is to unlock those places for supply. And transit can be part of that, but it's not so much what happens right on the transit station area, it's what happens a short Uber ride away from the transit station, right? That's where I think we can put supply that's going to be naturally more affordable. Because it's not going to be the whole new hip neighborhood that gets built, it's going to be the existing neighborhood that has some more housing in it. And I don't know how effective that is, and I don't see a lot of good examples of communities doing that, but to me the ADU strategy is sort of the tip of a bigger iceberg that includes 4-plexes and 8-plexes and townhouses and smaller projects that fit into neighborhoods that already have a middle-class identity. To me, that's how you protect those neighborhoods that are sort of working-class communities of colors. Let's not have them be the only places where we can build housing.
Okay, very well, thank you. If you'll indulge me, I'd like to ask one additional question, and then we'll open it up. And this question comes from some of Ann Sewell's presentation earlier in the morning. But gentlemen, each of you, given your deep expertise, we have regulation because we believe that there are positive, important attributes of regulation that make our cities better places to live. We also have many arguments that regulation has become entirely excessive in cost, excessive in time, and entirely burdensome in a way that, in fact, get in the way of making our cities efficient places to live. So, given your expertise, the 4 of you on the panel, if you could write on one piece of paper and send that piece of paper to the mayor, what part of local land use regulation pertinent to affordable housing provision should be retained, and what part should be jettisoned, gotten away with yesterday, what would your piece of paper look like? Specifics, please. And by the way, regulation is very politically topical today, because if you have perspectives on life in America which are similar to our new president, getting rid of unwanted regulation is really at the top of your list. So I'm not intending to provide any advertisement for any elected official. What I am suggesting is that we're going to hear a lot about regulation for the next couple of years. But gentlemen, given your affordable housing interests, what would you do with regulation in your blue sky, beautiful future of Los Angeles? Sure, go.
All right. Well, I think these are solutions that are somewhat specific. Maybe my skies aren't quite blue enough, but the regulation that I would like to change, and this is more of a state regulation, that I would remove would be, or maybe alter, is in a CEQA lawsuit, include an attorney's fees provision. So that a CEQA lawsuit has to, really? Thank you, this is great, okay. After the meeting, let's all get together. No, really, I mean, yeah, right? So that's it. I mean, it's that simple. It's that if you're gonna file a CEQA lawsuit, you have to believe in your lawsuit. It can't just be a 3-year delay tactic. That would be one. The second is, as I mentioned in the presentation, would be I'd like to add a provision that would allow developers to sign forward contracts with home buyers before the entitlement process is over, so that we bring the people who are trying to move into that neighborhood or see the homes built into the political discourse with a financial stake.
By the way, thank you, Ben. And by the way, I just want to be really clear. I am not inferring or suggesting that regulation is bad or that all regulation should be jettisoned. I'm just trying to elicit an opinion on what regulation you think is good and useful and what regulation you think is burdensome and counterproductive.
Well, you took my took my thunder. Someone taught me a while ago, if you have a problem you can't solve, expand the problem. So you said specifically to Los Angeles, so I was going to CEQA too. CEQA is just a massive, massive problem. There's probably 8 things you could do to change the law, but it should be, for urban environments, it needs to be amended, changed, done away with, something, because and I think that the city had it right. And at one point, I think they had an initiative to go from 12 to 2, I believe it was, steps to get entitled, right? That was what I would want. One of the things about working in San Francisco is that it takes a long time, but it's very predictable. Like, you know who's going to sue you, you know you're going to get sued, you know it's going to take 2 years, you know you're going to win. So it's predictable. It's predictable. It just takes a long time. In Los Angeles, you have no idea. It could go quickly. It could take a long time. You could get a fight from over there and a fight from over there. Whereas last time you got a fight from over here. So it's just a really hard here in LA.
One other add-on to this, and anyone that wants to add as well. Let me just add this little piece on, and then I'm going to be quiet, and you all will jump in. There's a professor here at UCLA, a distinguished professor who has spent his entirety of his research career looking into the topic of parking. And you might think that that's odd, or you might think it's really right on the money. But Kevin, you mentioned this earlier as well. What if, in terms of regulation, our parking requirements were radically reduced? What sort of, you mentioned your experience with this. What if we reduce those parking requirements in the immediacy of transit? What would happen, so then, like Rick here, he's talking about NIMBYism, and Ben's talking about NIMBYism, and maybe I'm not so optimistic about NIMBYism, but if you say that some of this NIMBYism might, use the word might, be related to congestion impacts of development. You take away the cars, maybe you take away a big part of the congestion impacts, and you force this compact urban area that Kevin's talking about, where people are less reliant on cars and more reliant on transit. So the mundane regulatory requirement of parking, if one or more of you could please factor that into your remarks.
You haven't already done that?
Well,
I think the city right now is going through some changes around that. I think they're switching from maximums to minimums. I think I got that right. So you have to do a minimum amount of parking as opposed to a maximum amount of parking requirements. Maybe it's the other way around. Thank you. Maximum as opposed to a minimum. That's it. Okay, thank you. If I were a betting man, I would be shorting parking. I think parking is not much longer for this world. There are so many things that are coming that are going to change our relationship to the car, which might be anathema to Angelinos as we are. But I have all this, I'm looking around at my buildings, and I have on the one building where our offices are, we have 5 stories below grade of parking. Right? When we built the building, it was 1 per bedroom, I think, that we built the parking. So we have an abundance of parking. And I keep thinking when everyone's doing autonomous cars and Ubers and public transit and biking and whatever else they're doing, they're not owning cars. What am I going to do with all that square footage that I now own that's below grade, so I'm not turning it into more apartments? What am I going to do with it all? Right? I mean, I could turn it into storage, which actually generally in my buildings makes more money than parking. But because you never have enough storage in an apartment. But you know, I see all this parking, and what am I going to do with it all? So I think parking is something which just naturally starts to happen, and you could argue whether it's tomorrow or 10 years from now, but it's going to change significantly, in my opinion.
I just want to add to that you know, the rate of innovation in the housing development field may be very low, but the rate of innovation in the transportation field is enormously high. And just yesterday, Larry Page, one of the founders of Google, launched the flying car company. Yeah. And like, you might think, oh, that's crazy, but actually that technology is coming, and it's coming in our lifetimes. Like, maybe it'll be a bizarre, you know, specialty product, but like, they're building those cars now. And we're just still thinking about, like, what do we do in 1950? It's 1950, right? We need to build more parking. We have to get ahead of that curve a little bit.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, questions? Mott.
First of all, what a pleasure to listen to this panel. The clarity and articulateness and policy alignment, awesome. Brief comment, then I'd love a response. I believe that, I love what you said, Rick, about Econ 101 and people taking really simple analyses and over-applying them for solutions. One of those simple analyses I heard you articulated, Kevin, when you said we can't build our way out of it. I think all of us understand what we mean by that. But when you look at Rick's comment about segmentation, you also can't not build your way out of it. And there's something that in Northern California they're referring to as the NIMBY affordable complex. I love this term. Where basically the attitude is don't build anything, but make it affordable. And as Ben, you said, the rich are always going to outbid the poor in the housing game of musical chairs. And so if we don't have supply, we're not going to solve our problem. And so with the idea that you can't, and then the other Ben, you mentioned residual land value, a concept that a lot of people misunderstand. They think that residual land values going up means that property owners make more money. I believe residual values going up means that more transactions actually consummate. And I'm curious if you guys could address that last point, because I think there's a lot of fear about making it easier to develop and increasing residual land values for developers, and thinking it's simply going to be a windfall for property owners. We might as well not do it and just raise fees and taxes and inclusionary requirements, stuff like that.
Can I show the slide that I skipped?
Absolutely.
I don't know if it's still, oh, it's not going to work. Something died there. I had a map of Portland from a ULI report, and they looked at like where in the city is the rent high enough for development to pencil out at the lowest possible, you know, feasible cost per unit. And it was, you know, Portland's a hot market city. It was half of the city where it was feasible, and the other half where it wasn't. And the number of places where the math works is relatively small, and of those places, a huge share of them, we don't allow multifamily development. So there's even fewer places. There's just a few locations in every city where you can actually visa both politically and financially, where those two things align, so you can actually build something. So to me, the challenge is to expand the number of places where the math works. And that's something that is doable, and maybe it's hard, but like we really don't have any other option.
And that's going to shift a lot, right? I mean, any given day, it'll move, right? So you have to have, I think, a government that's willing to move quickly around where that affordability is. But to be more direct towards your question, Mott, I mean, I look at it the way that I look at energy, right? Solar is not going to solve our energy problem. Wind is not going to solve our energy problem. We need everything to solve our energy problem. So in this housing conversation, we need everything. We need all of the tools available to help solve the problem.
And to your comment about, the increasing residual land value, and that's what gets us transactions. That's exactly what I was trying to say in that slide. Thank you for articulating it for the rest of the group. But I think that what is interesting in that, and a neighbor's concern that all the value is accruing to the property owner, or the developer is going to make a bunch of profit. I think, and I'm sorry I keep coming back to this theme, but I feel like the concern, which borders on anger and is anger in some cases of these community groups that watch this happen, is it's sort of like, why is this person benefiting? Why is the property owner benefiting? Why is this developer making so much money by taking away my views or increasing traffic? And I think that it's just got to be part of this public discourse that we need to bring the people who will and must benefit from this. We need to bring them, faces, names, anecdotes into this conversation, because otherwise, I mean, I've said this at a community meeting before. I said, like, if you approve this project, I will do something to shame myself. I will embarrass myself. If what you're looking for is shame and embarrassment and loss of money, I will do it. But that sometimes is the attitude. It's sort of like they see the developer as the agent who is going to benefit from this, when in fact the conversation needs to continue to focus on that middle income family. Who is that? What do they need?
Something that's on my mind is that who subsidizes housing? You've talked earlier about housing segmenting, and by a very, very large margin, the federal government subsidizes homeowners through the mortgage interest deduction. 70% of federal subsidies directly go to homeowners, and the highest beneficiaries are the earners over $100,000 a year. And the federal government currently has not only been reducing its investment in low-income housing, it's currently proposing to stop investment in low-income housing, extremely low-income housing. And so I have kind of two questions. One question is, should government be involved in housing? And if so, is it a federal issue, a state issue, or a city issue? Or county? What level of government should be involved? And then secondly, shouldn't we be thinking about the subsidy? Where should the subsidies go? Should the subsidies be going to homeowners earning over $100,000, or should they be going to a different segment? And how would you approach those kinds of changes?
Can I try that? Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons that I've gotten interested in this middle income housing question is because I feel like the subsidy should go to low-income people. And what I've been seeing is a lot of my clients in local government are feeling an enormous amount of pressure to redirect the shrinking pie of subsidy toward middle-income families. And I can understand that, right? But that's, like, if the market could solve that problem, we'd be better off, because then we'd have more money for where the real need is. Most of my work is on inclusionary housing, and I see cities generating residual land value all the time with things like upzoning, and I think it's totally appropriate to say to the public, we're gonna have a requirement. Either you pay a linkage fee or you provide affordable units, and we're gonna have some of that benefit go to lower income people. I don't feel, though, that that's the solution to the affordable housing problem. I think that's the solution to how we get buy-in to a higher scale and higher pace of development. And what we see in the high-cost areas, at least, is it makes a big difference when people see the developers not humiliating themselves, but providing something at the low end of the spectrum. And it's, I think we produce enough inclusionary housing that it's a meaningful contribution. I don't think it's purely symbolic, but the symbolic value is not something to trifle with. It really matters to people to see the development contributing lower income units. And the biggest complaint we hear about inclusionary housing these days is that those units aren't low enough income. So I think that it's okay if that's not the whole solution, but we need to show people visually that everybody has a stake in higher growth and in more development. And that's, to me, the answer to this, like, well, we only want affordable units. Well, when you have inclusionary, you don't get the affordable units unless you also get the market rate units. And that's the coalition that I think can win.
my experience, Helmy, since you and I have talked a bunch about this, I feel like the more levels that you can get the private sector to solve, then as Rick mentioned, then there's the more money to help those that truly need help. The problem that I'm finding is, so my example in San Francisco, where the city bought units from me, they spent whatever, $600,000 a unit to preserve this unit at 120% of median income. If you guys know San Francisco, on the Embarcadero, right? Like super great real estate, right? Now, when we built there in the 80s, it was not super great real estate, and it was a redevelopment project, and the city gave us the land and all that stuff. But could that $600,000 have per unit gone someplace else and produced more units at different income levels? Yes, it probably could have. But they felt the need that they had to protect not the unit, they had to protect the people in the unit. Actual people in the unit. It was the people that they were really worried about. And look, some of that is political, right? Some of that is the politicians saying, if I have 173 evictions in my district, that's not good for me. So I'm going to push the money that direction. So there's lots of things going on, but lack of subsidy is a big problem. All the product being built in downtown, no affordable housing, is because of no inclusionary and no subsidy, right? And as you and I have also talked a lot about, my opinion, there needs to be a balance, right? Inclusionary zoning eventually balances out because I think it has an effect on land value. So land value will come down if you have inclusionary zoning, and then it will start to come back up because we have a supply problem. But there needs to be a balance. The 80-20 tax credit bonding deals provide a benefit to the developer, which sometimes works and sometimes doesn't, but produces affordable housing. So that's the conversation.
So on your wonderful philosophical question, I believe deeply, really, the answer is all levels of government need to be involved in housing. And I think we are, in some sense, here lucky. LA, California are both relatively high capacity, sophisticated governmental actors. I think one of the challenges at the federal level, speaking from my past life, is there are a lot of states that don't have the kind of capacity that California is. There are a heck of a lot of cities that don't have the capacity that LA do. And so there is a role, I think, at the federal level to continue to embrace an activist housing policy. And particularly right now, today, the tax credit program and obviously our ongoing rental assistance programs are just core to our ability to make anything else we want to do at the state and local level work. You know, on the mortgage interest deduction, that, as everybody in this room knows, I'm sure, is yes, it's a very fundamentally regressive subsidy program, but it's also one that is massively entrenched politically. And it's interesting, over the last few months, there was a brief mention by the Secretary of the Treasurer that the mortgage interest deduction might sort of be on the table in some limited way as part of comprehensive tax reform. And then I believe it was pretty quickly backed off of that. We do have a proposal at the state level right now that would, sponsored by Assembly Member Chu, I believe, that would eliminate with the state mortgage interest. So you have both federal and state mortgage introductions that are both very significant. And the proposal is that you would eliminate the mortgage introduction for second homes. So vacation homes would no longer benefit, which seems, intuitively reasonable, no brainer. I'll just say that it's not a slam dunk. It's going to hit a heck of a lot of political opposition from, again, a lot of interest, probably from associations that many of you are members of, in terms of trying to get that through, to get the necessary votes, even in a legislature with Democratic supermajorities.
Do we have time? Sure. Okay. So very quickly, in my role as the chair of the Housing Authority, this is, to answer the first part of the question, absolutely. I think that we do need government support at all levels in our housing market there until we can and hopefully will get to a point where the private market, as you were saying, is taking a much greater role. It's essential. There are so many people in our city that simply need assistance. They're not going to be able to provide for themselves in terms of housing. I think that the challenge, one interesting challenge that's going to become, I think, more public with the Housing Authority soon, is that we're going to open up our wait list again, which we haven't done for years. And I think what this has exposed is this challenge of, and this sort of goes in the same way as zoning. Like once you zone something, you've created something, you've created some benefit, but down the road there, you've distorted the market in some way. So with a benefit such as an inclusionary housing unit that's assigned to a particular person, a particular building. The challenge is that at some point it's full, and how we can turn that into something that is more like the private housing market, where there is a cycle of housing. It's a ladder where you can move to a different unit and eventually move out on your own. I was shocked to hear this, and some of you may already know this, but the wait list to get into one of our housing authority developments right now, I believe, is 11 years. Yeah. I couldn't believe it when I heard that. It was crazy. So, yes, more subsidy, but I think this is actually where some of our private partners who are working on affordable housing can be really helpful, is thinking about how to help continue to use these assets to find capacity to move people through and get them on the housing ladder. Or, yeah.
Something that Kevin touched upon a little bit earlier about the relative ease of working in some communities versus others, and the predictability of being able to get your project through. Similar to what Hemley did in terms of describing, I'm on the private sector, but a reformed public agency person, and so seeing both sides of the picture, what I start to wonder is, you have communities that are certainly easier to work with than others, and have certain tools that they may make available and use on a daily basis. What I start to think is that for development communities, and developers in particular, know when they are certain communities they want to work in and others that they just will never want to step foot in. What I start to wonder is that, you see those types of communities, then the ones that are a little bit more positive be able to generate a lot more housing opportunity. And I was at a conference a couple of weeks back, where the mayor of a certain community talked about how they saw housing as an integral part of their economy, that they were not only just going to embrace it in terms of development opportunity, but actually in terms of building industry around it. And that community, I was surprised to hear, is the third largest in Los Angeles County after Los Angeles and Long Beach. It's no longer Pasadena, it's not in Santa Monica, it's Santa Clarita. And the fact that they look at it as, they translated that interest in supporting housing to doubling their population in the last 15 years. They are now over 200,000 people. So all that to say that there may be some sort of best practices, and maybe, Ben, you might want to speak a little bit to this, about the fact that your housing policy unit really has contact on an annual basis with communities throughout the state. And maybe there's opportunities to build the kind of best practices database, be able to help cities be able to know what can have been proven means to be able to support housing development in their areas where there is a political will.
That's great. Thank you for teeing me up on that. So we do every 8 years go through a housing element cycle where we allocate the projected units that we know we're going to need for each unit, to get built to meet forthcoming demand. Those are allocated out to the cities. The cities then are obligated under state law to show that they have planned for that growth, which is their fair share of the entire pot. And today we have actually a remarkably high compliance rate. I'm proud to say almost 90% of jurisdictions are in compliance. They're doing that work on paper. The challenge is the disconnect between a good plan on the shelf and production getting built. And that's, I think, where we know we have more work to do. There are legislative fixes that are being proposed again in this session that'll give some more teeth behind that housing element process, ways to link, I think, and incentivize jurisdictions to deliver on that, which we need to get onto. But I will say on the data side, we are doing a lot of good work there, and I'll just give a little bit of a teaser here. We will be releasing later this year, finally, all of our site inventory data for all of California in a GIS kind of machine readable format. So you can go to any city anywhere in California at any time and see which sites they have designated to handle their share of housing growth. We think that'll have a lot of great research opportunities overlaying this visual data with other data sets. And then we will also hopefully trying to fold into an appendix, if you will, to our state housing assessment, be doing a comprehensive survey of every jurisdiction in California, working with some research partners to actually catalog what the local measures they have in place are, the local regulatory barriers, if you will, to try to get to the best practices and say, okay, what do we see are the Santa Clarita being one example, what are it and other peers doing, and what do they have in common that we can all be learning from collectively, and we'll be working to create some case studies that I think will be helpful in this conversation.
But one of the funniest things about publicly assisted and whatever, it's a density bonus or with subsidy or whatever it is it's tends to be subject to more regulation, particularly in the workforce arena. And there's an awful lot of interest. I know, Kevin, you sort of threw a little bit of cold water on the whole modular housing thing, and I appreciate that. I do realize Ben and I were talking about this is sort of like a 7-year storm, like a locust. Modulars, they're good. This is the moment. This is the moment for modulars. But it seems like offsite framing, a whole bunch of other sort of alternative building methods are really important to this topic. And yet in the process of developing, whether it's middle income housing or tax credit housing, whatever, those never move forward because anytime you have public subsidy touching a project, the folks that are opposed to modular or alternative building methods have a slam dunk way to shut it down in the public process. So I guess the question is there a win-win out there? Is there a way for us to actually meet the goals of local hire, fair wages for construction workers? There was this big piece in the LA Times the other day about this. Like, how do we get past this so that we can actually build more cheaply, assuming that it still meets Kevin's quality goals here, which may not for you, but for the rest of us, maybe there's some alternatives around building methodologies or offsite framing. So I'm just trying to figure out how I can build for less in a way that it gets me through the political process around local hire and also prevailing wage and increasingly around PLAs. So that's an easy one. I think that should probably take like 10 seconds.
I could answer that very quickly. If everybody made more money, then it would be fine. No, seriously, the construction, when I look at a pro forma, by far the biggest line in my pro forma is my cost to build. So if I can get that cost down, then that's going to make a huge difference. And clearly, the construction industry is in need of some major innovation. And whether that's modular or whatever it is, there's lots of people thinking about that, but man, nothing has happened. I mean, other than power tools. Like what's happened to the building industry, I mean, I was just walking my building last week, and in a corner where they're framing up because of our structural requirements, they literally had 15 2x4s going in each direction at a corner, right? They're all 2x4s because they don't want different dimensional lumber on site. They want as few dimensions on the lumber as possible. So just line up 15 2x4s and nail them all together, as opposed to doing a 2x12 or whatever else other dimensional lumber, because it could wind up in the wrong place. So, it's just, that's just the way that contractors think. The other thing that I will say, and I'm not 100% who all is in this room, and I'll probably get myself in trouble, but as we project out our costs for buildings that we're going to be doing in 2, 3, 4 years, the labor rates, the wages for the union contractors that we're going to use, those are all locked in. Those are not changing. Doesn't matter what the economy does. Those are all locked in. So I know my labor is going up 2, 3, 4%, whatever, over the next 3, 4 years. So.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Eva Blaisdell. I am a chairman and a founder of California Space Center, and I represent a private sector. I am a private investor. I am a newcomer into the real estate area from the technology, from Silicon Valley, the place that we make money in easy way. And I came here to get educated as quickly as possible, because I am also a finalist in the real estate development in Los Angeles that potentially is a trendsetter for the future of the city. I don't think this development is known, because I think it's by invitation only. It's a Woodland Hills 42 acres. Inspired by the need of low-cost housing, also as a social entrepreneur, and because my source of funding is not from real estate, it is from Silicon Valley, from technology, I believe we can innovate certain business models for how low-income housing can be developed. And it doesn't mean low quality either. And we want to plug in a lot of technology into it. I am coming to the conclusion I have to develop my own value-add development company in order to bringing into fulfillment. So I would welcome your comments. Last point, I am my representatives, and I am in touch with people like Paul Allen, who is a real estate developer in Seattle, who did a lot of low-income housing development as a social mission. So you have us, we can take more risks, we can innovate. Bottom line, I am developing California Space Center as a nucleus also of jobs, because community, it's not only apartments, also a community. So the entertainment, California Space Center entertainment space, entertainment jobs in middle of a valley which is forgotten, to feed back to millennials. And my housing is aimed at millennials, so I liked your townhouse concept, because they can grow into it. So influence me, give me a feedback. Thank you.
You want to take a shot at that?
Here's my card. I'd be happy to build the housing with you. I think employee housing is a very interesting concept, and one. I mean, look, I build my apartment buildings vacant, right? I won't build an office building vacant, but I'll build an apartment building vacant. So I think it's there's some interesting stuff there that is worth we could talk.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we've about come to the conclusion now. I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking our panel.